Welcome to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
Could mythical sea monsters actually be based on real creatures? Does New England have its own lake monster? Who or what is Ogopogo?
Hello and welcome to the 867th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno. Coming to you live from WOON AM and FM radio in Woonsocket, Rhode Island on the Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live and on TuneIn.com. I'm Ben, and those somewhat slimy questions came from my co-host, partner in Paranormal Adventures, and dad, Paul. And today we bring you a living legend. And if you'd like to be a part of the show or you'd like to ask any questions, you can give us a call at 401-766-1240. That's from anywhere. You can email Paul at behindtheparanormal.com, or you can shoot us a message via Facebook Messenger or any other social media that we happen to be upon.
Nick Redfern works full-time as an author, lecturer, and journalist. He's written a lot more books than we have, and he even wrote the foreword for my latest one. Our subject today, Nick's most recent book, Monsters of the Deep, published in August. In addition, Nick is all over radio and television, including current and past shows such as History Channel's Monster Quest and UFO Hunters, VH1's Legend Hunters, National Geographic Channel's The Truth About UFOs and Paranatural, and BBC's Out of This World, etc., etc., etc. Nick is a native of England but lives near Dallas, Texas. Nick Redfern, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal.
Well, thanks for having me on again.
Oh, it's always good. We always look forward to shows with you. Monsters of the Deep, do they really exist? And are we talking rerun dinosaurs here or what?
Well, I guess the book's kind of written in a sort of an encyclopedic fashion. So it covers everything from going way back, like Jonah and the whale, through to the Kraken, Loch Ness Monster, and the similar creatures to the Loch Ness Monster around the world, and reports from sailors, 1700s, 1800s, in the Atlantic and Pacific. So it really sort of covers just about every angle, and I mean, most people who reported these things, have gone on the record, and that includes, the captains of ships. So, from my perspective at least, we are talking about real creatures, but for the most part, unknown in terms of what they actually are.
Okay. Now, let's get into some specifics here in your book. Cheever Felch, who was that? And we're talking about the Gloucester, New England sea serpent. Now, we've done whole shows on that with Jeremy Robinson, who wrote a book about it. And what's your perspective on that one?
Well, I mean, this is an interesting angle, when you look at the story itself. And, we're talking about, I guess, what you would call, sort of a United States equivalent of the Loch Ness Monster. And you can actually find a lot of these equivalents all over the place, really. But the story itself, well, I'll just give you sort of a rundown on it.
Yes, please.
And it all revolves around New England, New York, and off the coastlines of the United States, and Massachusetts, and sightings were being made the sort of latter part of the 19th century in various locations, and it was sort of like an eerie period, because you had these sort of cases that coming, to the fore. Now, one of the witnesses was a guy named Obadiah Turner, and he talked about seeing this strange creature that was, I'm quoting here now, 15 fathoms more in length, and other reports as well. As you mentioned earlier, Cheever Felch. Now, he had a sighting when he was aboard a U.S. schooner called the Science, and he said of this particular creature, and again I'll quote for you, his colour is dark brown with white under his throat. His size we could not accurately ascertain, but his head is about 3 feet in circumference, flat and much smaller than his body. We did not see his tail, but from the end of the head to the farthest protuberance, was not far from 100 feet. I speak with a degree of certainty, being much accustomed to measure and estimate distances and length. So, in other words, what we've got is a very credible case from an intriguing and credible source, and where there was multiple different eyewitnesses, and for me, it's sort of one of those classic cases, really.
Well, it's interesting that we understand that it was once seen on land, and there were. My understanding was that there was one of the Europeans and two of the natives were going by in a boat and happened to see it curled up on the rocks, very rocky coast out there, and being a good early American, the guy tried to shoot it. So, so how are we looking with that?
Well, it's interesting because there are a lot of cases in relation to lake monsters where they've been seen briefly on the land. A friend of mine in this particular field as well actually wrote a book on the Loch Ness Monster, but from the perspective of the land cases. And, that demonstrates, how many land reports have been filed of lake monsters in and around Loch Ness and at other Scottish lochs as well. When someone can write an entire book on just the land cases, that demonstrates as to how often these creatures actually are seen out of the water. Yeah. And this kind of suggests, if they're coming, onto land, then they're probably not fish,
Yes.
And that's sort of one of the intriguing aspects is, what kind of animal could briefly come on the land but spend, most of the time on the water. And it's intriguing as well, a lot of these land cases, mirror cases around the world, like I said with Loch Ness, and then, you've got the United States, and it kind of suggests that these creatures, whatever they are, they're actually being seen and reported all around the world, because the similarities are clearly there.
Yeah. We have a report from, because there are a lot of people in New England here where we are who are interested in Champ, the Lake Champlain monster. And as a matter of fact, I remember Ben, we have a family in Vermont, so we'd go up to Burlington when Ben was little. And he was always into lake monsters. He's out of the booth right now, so I can talk about him. We would sit. There was a restaurant that had a floating dock where you could have your meals, and he would sit there and he would stare out at the lake the whole time. I don't think he'd eat anything. He was so interested. I mean, he was going to come up and shake his hand, So anyway, but the Loch Ness, I should say, the Lake Champlain monster. There were also reports of it being seen on the land. Here and there, particularly in the 19th century. So it is very interesting. I'd like to get a copy of the book about these land cases. So, Nick, what about... Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say the author's Roland Watson.
Watson.
If you just Google or go to Amazon, Roland Watson, you'll see Roland's done several books on the Loch Ness Monster.
Yeah, I've heard the name.
Yeah, but for me, the land case one is the most intriguing because it's sort of an angle that most people, even a lot of people in cryptozoology, don't know. About the land cases.
Absolutely. Okay, now what about the? I can say this because I know a little bit of Swahili. The Mokali Mbembe of the Congo. That's sort of almost a dinosaur rerun of some kind. Is not particularly a lake monster, but is seen generally on four legs. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, there's a reason why I mentioned that in the book, because technically it's not, like a lake monster per se, and it's certainly not a sea serpent. However, Mokali Mbembe, which kind of looks like a scaled-down brontosaurus, most of the reports that have been filed have said that for almost all of the time these creatures do live or sort of spend their time in the water. Now, we're sort of talking about, bathing and finding ways to keep cool, that kind of situation. But most of the witnesses do say, that they kind of just sort of lurk in the water as opposed to, sort of swim deep in the water, But I felt that it was important, if you're going to cover just about every kind of mysterious beast that could be perceived as water-based, I think Michele and Bembe, is one that sort of fits the category. Now, what's intriguing about the stories of Michele and Bembe in the Congo is that most of the native people in the area and people who visited and interviewed eyewitnesses have all said one thing that's sort of pretty much the same, and that is that these animals are extremely violent, kind of like the equivalent of a hippopotamus, which are equally dangerous and angry most of the time, if they're disturbed. So again, I think this is an intriguing story because we have all these little aspects, surrounding the story, and it would not surprise me, if these creatures are real. Now, a friend of mine, Richard Freeman, who was a former zookeeper
we know Richard,
in England.
Yeah. He's
What's
great.
That? What's that?
No, I said we know Richard. He's great.
Oh, cool, great.
Yeah,
he's a good guy. And Richard sort of speculated on the possibility, and I think it's a strong possibility, that we could be talking about huge monitor lizards. People think of like the closest I can think of is like the excuse me. If you've got sort of a large monitor lizard and
like
something
a Komodo dragon kind
about
of thing,
20, 25 feet in length, you probably wouldn't quibble that that's a monster.
Yeah.
And but on top of that as well, it's easy. If you were to have a number of these large monitor lizards, sort of hiding out in the marshes, in the lakes, but technically not actually being a lake monster, it adds a sort of another aspect to the story.
Okay. I want to get to some listener questions, but you are a sort of a globe-trotting fellow, and we've had a lot of interesting conversations with you about things you've seen in Puerto Rico, different parts of the world, this sort of thing. Have you been on the trail of any of these lake or sea creatures, and have you seen anything yourself?
Well, I haven't actually seen anything myself, unfortunately, but I guess what really got me into it was when I was about 5 or 6. My parents took me to Scotland for a week's vacation, and we spent a day at Loch Ness, and my dad told me the story of the Loch Ness Monster, and that's, I certainly wasn't doing research like some little precocious kid running around, but when I was about sort of 7 or 8, and following on from that first trip to Loch Ness, it really caught my imagination and attention, and I started to read, about the subjects, and made various trips to Loch Ness as I got older. But certainly in the United States, where there's a lot more reports. Yeah, I've done a lot of investigations over here, and a lot of people don't realize that there's a number of stories actually from Texas, where I live. I live just outside of Dallas, and I can go from west from here to a place called Lake Granbury, and Lake Granbury has its own legend of a lake monster, and it's known as One Eye, and and now some people, view this as just a legend, a folkloric story, that kind of thing. However, I've spoken to, I think it's either 4 or 5 people, which isn't that many, but the important thing is that nearly all the witnesses described something very, very similar, and what they did describe was not like a giant plesiosaur or anything like that, but it was actually like a giant eel. Now, that, to me, sounds, quite plausible, the idea, of a large eel, perhaps grown to massive size, and it's been perceived, if you like, as a monster or an unknown animal. But, if you're talking about an eel, maybe the length of sort of 20 feet, 25 feet, and the body, like the width of like a barrel, you probably wouldn't quibble that's a monster. And so I think, some of these cases that I've investigated involve unknown animals, but whereas the one with at Lake Granbury, One Eye, I would not be at all surprised if that was not a giant eel or a colony of giant eels.
Well, it's funny. When I was going to school up near the St. Lawrence River, I had a little boat, and I'd go out fishing. There would be muskellunge, which are related to sturgeon, I believe. These things they were longer than my boat, and you'd see this. I mean, unfortunately, they were rather docile, unless you caught them. And but I avoided that. I tried to stick mainly with bass, but these things were absolutely huge. So let's get to listener question here from our, I think Nick has heard of our faithful listener in Bogota, Colombia, Peter. And Peter has sent in a few questions for Nick.
Sure thing. Peter writes to us, please ask Nick to share his understanding of the Aleister Crowley connection to Loch Ness. Secondly, what is the story of the frog people also mentioned in his book?
Okay. Well, yeah, the whole issue of Aleister Crowley is an interesting one because this sort of takes the whole lake monster issue down a different pathway. And we're sort of talking about the idea that some of these lake monsters could have sort of a supernatural aspect attached to them. Now, most cryptozoologists don't go down that pathway of the supernatural or the paranormal. They view them all as either unknown animals or creatures assumed to have become extinct but are still around. However, particularly in and around the Loch Ness area, there have been a lot of really weird things over the years. Now, one of the classic examples is the fact that Aleister Crowley, the famous occultist and magician, actually had a house overlooking Loch Ness called Boleskine House. And we're talking about in the latter part of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. And he performed all sorts of rites and rituals and in the area. And there was a witch coven in the area as well. And the whole area is sort of shrouded in issues relative to magic. Kind of moving on from Crowley, in 1969, a well-known Nessie researcher named Ted Holliday, he and a couple of American tourists who were actually in Loch Ness at the time, they stumbled on this large sort of patchwork tapestry. And when more and more research was done, it was actually shown that that one of the pictures on the tapestry showed an ancient sea goddess named Tiamat, and she was like this dangerous creature that would pull you down into the depths. And there were rumors of sort of like a sacrificial cult in the area that was performing all sorts of bizarre rituals. And there have been UFO sightings over Loch Ness. Ted Holliday, who I just mentioned, in 1973, he had an encounter with nothing less than a man in black on the shores of Loch Ness. So in other words, there's this, you can make a case, certainly around Loch Ness, that there's a huge amount of occult history, paranormal history, supernatural history, all around that area, and all tied up with witch covens, with Aleister Crowley. And one of the theories is that Crowley helped, if you like, to increase the sightings of the Nesses by essentially kind of bringing them forth, so to speak.
Well, there you have it. Now, what about the frog people?
Well, again, this is a very strange story, particularly in the mid-1950s and particularly also in Ohio. There was a wave of sightings in various areas where people were seeing what became known as frog people. And it kind of sounds like something out of like H.P. Lovecraft, or something like that. But it's actually not far away. What people were reporting were sort of 4 to 5 feet tall creatures. We're not talking about, the so-called reptilians of today, like these giant sort of menacing lizard people, nothing like that. But they were sort of 4 to 5 feet tall with this sort of greyish, light green tinge, large eyes, and these very sort of blubbery lips. And on several occasions they were seen late at night, in one area being Springfield, and running across the road. One of the reports was actually seen by a police officer, sort of just squatting by the road, and then it just charged off. And all the witnesses essentially said the same thing. It was sort of like an upright reptile-type creature. And like so many of these weird stories that we all get, this wave suddenly, went away as quickly as it arrived in the first place.
Well, it provides enough for tourism fairs and things like that,
Yeah.
But no, not to say that didn't happen. But so we have something else here from. Go ahead, Ben. From Peter.
Of course. Yes. The questions never stop here on Behind the Paranormal. Lastly, as a kid, I absolutely loved a series of stories in DC Comics that depicted World War II soldiers encountering various prehistoric monsters in the Pacific, only as a fantasy. Or, Nick, have you discovered any real reports of this?
Oh, from the war, you mean?
I suppose that's the question.
Well, no, I'm actually not. I mean, wouldn't be surprised if there weren't reports, but I guess, for me, I don't think I've got any, specifically from the Second World War. But I think the primary reason for that would be because, everybody was focusing on the war, I suppose. So,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Well, I must say that Peter sent 3 illustrations of covers from these comic books, and I love the one where there are a bunch of dinosaurs hitting the beach from a amphibious landing craft, and the American and Japanese soldier, I guess, have gotten together out of necessity and are trying to fight the dinosaurs. I don't think anything like that actually happened, but I love the landing craft bit.
Well, you never know. I mean, who knows what was encountered, during warfare. I mean, I guess for the most part, if something like that was actually seen by military personnel, they'd have to sort of just focus on what they were doing, trying to stay alive. But it wouldn't surprise me, I mean, it's just that it was such a very turmoil-filled era that it would be very difficult, I think, to sort of chronicle all of the reports that, when you're on the battlefield or whatever.
Well, I think there's something sort of fascinating about and mysterious about our bodies of water throughout the Earth. And I think if there's any more sort of case that I can think of that's more illustrative of sea monsters being real, it's the discovery of Architeuthis, the giant squid, and it's one of those things where biologists completely denied its existence until someone just I think it might have been a Japanese fishing vessel that actually got footage of it, and this was probably 20 years ago now, maybe a little more recent than that. Of this creature being found, and the more we kind of discover Earth's oceans and the more that we explore it, the more weird things we're finding with it, which doesn't kind of push any of this out of the realm of possibility, because what's the old saying? It's not even old. We know more about the surface of the moon than we do about our own oceans. And there are points in which we haven't been able to explore, fully, including the Marianas Trench and many other portions of sort of underwater topography.
Yeah.
Because it's you can only do so much with the technology you have, and it kind of brings to mind something I'll bring up after the break because we're kind of coming up to it. And if anybody remembers the docufiction thing that came out a few years ago on the Discovery Channel, I think it was called Mermaids: The Body Found, back in 2012, when everyone thought it was a real documentary about mermaids, but it was just it was a piece of fiction.
Well, there were reports.
It was done really well, though.
It was done really well. They even made a website for it that supposedly got taken down. It was by the South African government or something.
Well, you don't mess with the South African government.
No.
Anyway, it's our We'll take our middle of the show break here, and you're listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM and 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley with our amazing guest, Nick Redfern. We'll be right back.
The night is alive. Join us and take a walk on the weird side when you tune in to The Kingdom of Nye, hosted by Heather Wade, the finest in late night talk. Listen live free weeknights starting at 9 p.m. Pacific Time at thekingdomofnye.com, talkstreamlive.com, and the Paranormal Radio app. Wanna take a ride?
Local and live at 99.5 FM.
And welcome back to Behind the Paranormal here on WOON Radio. And we're talking with our great guest, Nick Redfern, and about his the many books, but certainly his latest book, Monsters of the Deep. Just before we get back to that, I remember I was in Argentia, Newfoundland, in the line of duty many years ago before you were born. And I remember stories that they would tell of, particularly a period up until about 1920, when Architeuthis would come up to the surface and literally grab people out of boats in the area between Newfoundland Island and Labrador. You know, particularly people who were fishing. I don't know, maybe he was trying to defend his fellow fish or something. But anyway, it was. I heard those stories.
Kraken.
Yeah. So Nick, we have another question here, and this is from Lauren in Connecticut.
Okie dokie. And Lauren writes to us. Does Nick have any reports from military or fishermen or other boaters of sightings of monsters or unusual creatures in 2020?
In 2020? No, I haven't got any that's sort of, really right up to date. Well, the closest I can think of is actually the quite astonishing number of reports of the Loch Ness monsters that there's been this year. Sonar reports, photographs, footage, and we really haven't had anything like this for a long time. I mean, typically, people might find this surprising, but usually there's only about 3 or 4 good cases, sightings per year. It's not much, and considering how many people go there every year, in their thousands. So most people don't see anything. But for whatever reason, this year has been sort of an amazing year. And if you Google Loch Ness Monster Sonar, you'll see the latest story about where the captain of a ship recorded the movements of something round about the length of about 30 feet deep inside Loch Ness. And this was all recorded on sonar. But that's about the closest I can think of for anything that's sort of, really up to date.
There's a second part of the question, which is actually pretty good, and probably one thing we were going to hop into at some point, but might as well. Engines are roaring. So what are Nick's thoughts regarding these creatures being unknown ones, but normal from the deepest oceans, versus creatures that might be from other dimensions or other worlds?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. Because I'll tell you for why. Because everybody who's sort of looking into these cases and sightings are sort of, trying to apply the reality behind surrounding it, that it all relates to either animals that we think have become extinct, or that they're just normal animals grown to large sizes. But I think a good case could be made that at least some of these creatures could actually be, getting back to the question, they could be, totally unknown. The possibility that we've never found and identified some of these creatures. I mean, that wouldn't surprise me at all with the Loch Ness Monster. If they are flesh and blood and not supernatural, I think, a very good, strong case could be made that if we find one, we're going to be like, wow, we've actually found something that no one has ever seen before. And so I think that's a possibility. And as to the other part about, sort of multi-dimensional issues, well, again, that has popped up in a number of Loch Ness cases. for example, Jim Mars, the late Jim Mars, who was more of a sort of conspiracy theorist than anything else. Jim interviewed for one of his books a team that used to work for the CIA in remote viewing, and for whatever reason, at one point, the CIA actually remote viewed Loch Ness, and the several remote viewers that were looking into this said that every time they tried to remote view the Loch Ness monsters, they would see it briefly swimming in the water, and then it would literally be gone, as if it was just sort of, with a click of a finger, it was in a different realm of existence. So that actually does kind of, that absolutely parallels, the question. And so maybe there is sort of, in a very strange fashion, maybe there is sort of like a flesh and blood angle to it, but also some kind of multi-dimensional aspect to it as well.
Well, I mean, you'd think the logic would be at this point, all the research and time and effort that's been poured into it, something would be found, right? I mean, there were a few sort of red herrings here and there, but it's there's so much research has been done, and little to nothing has been found. Maybe like a piece of controversial, footage or something caught on a sonar. But, I know from what I remember of the Loch Ness Monster Loch Ness in general, is that there's a huge underwater cave network. But at the same time, right, something would be found. Whatever it may be, right? It just doesn't make sense if it's a flesh and blood creature that sort of just hangs around in the water that you wouldn't see it, especially if there's so much attention on it.
Yeah, I mean, you can kind of look at it two ways. You can look at it like that, and then you've got the other angle that, if the Loch Ness Monsters, because there are so few reports every year, chances are they are, some kind of fish, something along those lines, because if they were like a crocodile, a reptile, they'd be surfacing all the time, like about every 20 minutes for oxygen. And we'd be seeing them all the time, and we're not, So, but I think, one of the reasons, and this one often gets sort of overlooked, I guess, one of the reasons why I think, we haven't got the hard evidence just comes down to the logistics of funding. For example, most of us in the field of monster hunting, cryptozoology, we don't have the money to hire a mini submarine, to go under Loch Ness for a month or something. We'd all be bankrupt, probably collectively bankrupt.
Yeah, that's true.
So I think there's that angle, and there's also the fact that something else that a lot of people may not know is that Loch Ness, it's roughly round about 22 miles long, a mile wide, and about 750 feet deep. But when you go into the water at Loch Ness, you only have to go down, sort of 10, 15 feet, and the water is literally black. And the reason is because all around Loch Ness, it's surrounded by these huge sloping hills, and the dirt there is extremely black. And because it rains a lot, over the centuries, all of this black soil has been pushed into the loch, and that's why you can barely see anything in Loch Ness. That's why some of the underwater pictures are so fuzzy, and also why we haven't been able to find much, because it really is kind of just like sort of like going through dishwater, really.
That's
well,
true.
It's ironic that I think perhaps Lauren's point for mentioning 2020 might have something to do with the fact that this year has been so bizarre that I don't think any of us would be surprised if the alligators came up out of the sewers and started directing traffic. So, speaking of which, there was Teddy May, I guess, Commissioner of Sewers in New York City, was talking about alligators. Can you get into a little bit of that?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's an interesting story. Everybody sort of heard, the legends, if you like, of alligators in the sewers, that kind of thing. And, they really have become sort of part of, I guess, American folklore and history, Now, a lot of people would say there is no actual history to this. But Teddy May, in the 1930s, when he was running the sewers or overseeing them, I should say, in New York and actually elsewhere in the areas as well. They actually, on one occasion, they really did capture a small alligator. Now, this isn't sort of legend or friend of a friend story. This is actually true. And now, it wasn't like some, sort of 15-foot man-eater or anything like that. It was, I think, around about 3 to 4 feet length in total. And it was captured, and that's how the story began. Now, almost certainly, it was probably somebody's pet. It got too big, and they didn't want to kill it. They didn't want to, whatever. And so they just put it in the sewers, and that's how it began. Now, what I think probably has happened is that the impetus at the beginning was this story, which was a kind of a minor story, but it was interesting as well. You see the headline, Alligator in New York. Everybody's going to see that and read it. However, I think what's happened is that this actually quite small story has sort of spilled over into an incredible legend, which it actually still is around now. Everybody knows the stories, but it's not as exciting as, it potentially could have been.
Well, it's funny. When I was a kid, it was a big deal if you went to Florida. And it was like the late 50s, early 60s, and you had a friend who had ceramic flamingos on metal legs standing in their yard in their garden or something. You'd say, oh, wow, they've been to Florida. That was kind of a symbol, and it was a big deal. Now everybody goes to Florida. But it was sometimes people would bring back baby alligators. It was pretty dumb in my opinion. But so, what do you do when they grow up? And
to the sewers with them.
Yeah, people would flush them down the toilet when they start. And that's when I first heard the alligator in the sewer thing. I said, wow, I wonder if that might be the origin of some of that, and it might not be true.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if that didn't happen. That kind of thing didn't happen all the time. I mean, kind of ironically, about a year or so after I immigrated to the United States, this would have been 2001, there was a sighting of a strange creature in a place called Roman View Lake, which is just about 15 minutes drive from where I actually used to live, and people were seeing this strange thing in the water, and there was a story that one of the local ducks got pulled into the water, but I don't know if that is true or not. But it turned out that when people were drawing pictures of it, it was almost certainly a snapping turtle, and again it was probably a pet. But it kind of developed the mythology of a lake monster when it was really a small pond with a snapping turtle in it. But people are fascinated by these things, and I wanted to sort of stress to people, that we're not always talking about giant monsters. Sometimes, the way our minds work, we love mysteries, and a story of a small pond, with a snapping turtle can very quickly become the local version of Nessie, when it's actually not at all.
Well, it's funny. A few years ago, I would always, until they opened this will be of interest to the local audience, until they opened the the bike trail and walking trail in Blackstone up to Millville, Mass., which is beautiful. I would always walk down in Lincoln, Rhode Island, by the Blackstone River. And the Blackstone is an old river. It's obviously natural, certainly, and but it's full of dams from the old mills. And I was walking down there one day. Nobody else was around, but I did manage to get pictures of this. There was a huge stirring in the water, and this head came up. I couldn't believe it, and I got a picture of it. And I sent the pictures to, and of course it looked at me with this venomous, and then it disappeared. And I sent, Rhode Island is very small. We all know each other, so I know the head of the Department of Environmental Management. And I sent her the photographs of this along with their chief biologist. And we had a lot of fun going back and forth about what this was. And the biologist thought, well, it could very well be a very, very large snapping turtle. But I was thinking more python, which have been running rampant in the eastern United States for a number of years now, when people would release them when they were pets. And they love water, and I'm wondering if it wasn't that sort of thing. So do you think the black, I started to call it Blackie, the Blackstone River monster, it could either be a gigantic snapping turtle or even more likely, from what I saw, a python from the shape of the head?
Oh, yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, you see something like that, and it looks kind of weird and not the sort of thing you see, every day. It's easily, sort of where it suddenly becomes a monster, and all the sort of connotations that go along with the word monster. So, yeah, I mean, particularly, huge snakes, you see them sort of wriggling along in the waters. You could easily see why somebody could say, well, that was like a lake monster. And in one sense, it would be, I guess,
Because here it wouldn't have survived the winter.
Well, that's right. I mean, we get occasionally reports from in the UK of snakes being found, at the edge of a canal, dead, and it's sort of like November or December, which is tough enough for people to survive in England, in December when it's that cold. But for pythons, I mean, they stand no chance. So there have been a few cases like this. So, I think, some cases can be demystified. One that I often get reports of, I would say 3 or 4 reports a year in Texas, where people have seen what they thought were unknown animals in the rivers, and particularly in the Trinity River in Texas. But when they described it, it was clear what they were talking about was an ancient and quite rare fish known as the alligator gar, which looks kind of like something from the, the prehistoric era. If you look at a picture of an alligator gar, there's a reason why it's called that, because it's not an alligator, but it actually looks quite like one. And as I said, it's very ancient, very rare. Most people don't see them, but when you do, it's like, wow, we saw a monster. So, I think alligator gars, pythons, when you've got a large snapping turtle, or even like a large regular turtle as well. The stories of giant turtles, like the size of a car. And so I think we can put all of these sightings, I should say, into one category if you want to. You could place them all in sort of water monsters, which they are, but when you look into it, there's an incredible body of different angles, you can go with these stories.
Yeah, no, that's fairly accurate. There was I used to be a very large fan of the television program River Monsters, and it was a fascinating show. And I remember there was
a good one, that wasn't it?
Yeah, it was really good. Jeremy Wade was the guy on it. It was really fascinating. And there was one particular episode that stuck out, which was Jeremy Wade went on a little trip to Chernobyl, specifically to fish in the runoff canals of Reactor 4. Was that?
I think it was 3.
Reactor 3. I don't know. I should know this. And the fascinating thing was he caught a giant catfish. But the thing was, for its age, it was actually a lot smaller than it should have been, which is the interesting thing. You hear radiation and all of this, that'll make things bigger. In fact, it's the opposite. I guess it actually stunted some of the cell growth and ended up giving it a form of cancer. So it's growing in some ways, but not in others. And this kind of leads into the question of how many of these reports could effectively be modern mutants, altered by pollution and things like that.
Well, I actually have an entire story an entire chapter in the book about that. Now, Richard Freeman, who we mentioned earlier, former zookeeper, Richard has an interesting theory for at least some lake monsters, and he is of the opinion, or the theory, that possibly, when you've got pollution in lakes and things like this, it may actually affect, the sterility, or provoke sterility, particularly in eels. And Richard has noted that, eels, that they migrate. That's the one thing everybody knows what eels do. The Sagrasso Sea and back again. And Richard has found that where there's been high pollutants, where there's also been eel-like monsters, particularly in the UK, it's where there's a great deal of this pollution as well. And so we may be looking at a situation where we're actually creating our own monsters. Now, one particularly fascinating story that I was given directly from the eyewitness relates to the sighting near a lake in Minnesota just a few years ago, and the witness claimed it was like a large frog. And I said, well, how large are you talking about? And it was like the size of like a German Shepherd. Now, you can either take it one way or the other. There's no real, in between. If you see something that's like a frog, the size of a German Shepherd, you cannot, sort of explain it other than that, or it was a hoax. There's no way to go down, any other pathway. However, what's intriguing is that the U.S. government's U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS, in 1995 got very concerned. This is a legitimate story. Got very concerned because frogs in Minnesota, and actually in one of the lakes where this report came from as well, started to be born with mutations. Like, for example, they would have like an extra limb or an extra eye. And in one case, the frog had developed 2 more legs, and they were sort of fully functioning, and the frog was quite happy, to have 2 more legs. But again, this was due to pollutants getting into the Minnesota rivers and lakes. And if you Google Minnesota frogs pollution, you'll find the U.S. government's entire report on how and why these frogs started to mutate in Minnesota. So for that reason, the fact that this guy saw this frog the size of a German Shepherd, when you put that next to the U.S. government's report, it really actually does make me think, wow, perhaps this really was the real deal.
I've heard that pharmaceuticals, by way of human waste, have also created a sort of a unique kind of pollution in the environment and are affecting wildlife in that way, particularly water creatures.
Well, it kind of makes you wonder, right? Like, if this is just one isolated case, one lake somewhere, what about anywhere else?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. And as I said, the interesting scenario is that some of our monsters today are of our own creation. And that sort of begs the question, well, what else could be potentially mutated by our activities? And well, maybe that's what we're actually starting to see. Yeah.
Well, Nick, tell us about some more about the book, your other books, if there's time, and your website where people can find out more.
Well, I have a blog which is World of Whatever, so just look for Nick Redfern, World of Whatever, you'll see my blog. The new book, Monsters of the Deep, you can get it off Amazon, and you can also get it off the shelves in Barnes & Noble as well, for people who still like to go into bookstores. And I'm working on another book right now, and, well, actually I've got one which is out right now. It's called The Martians. It's a study of all the strange, weird anomalies that have been found on the surface of Mars. And then earlier next year, I'll have another book out, and it'll be sort of an A to Z of time travel.
Wow.
And people can also reach me at Facebook and Twitter, Nick Redfern, UFO.
Excellent. Well, we're going to have you back on the show soon. And as a matter of fact, I think we have time for one little brief question. The bunyip. When I was in Australia in '79, that came up in a conversation with an Aboriginal elder. But we were talking about other things, but that was mentioned. What is that about, the bunyip?
Well, this is like a really strange story. The bunyip is like a really strange-looking animal. It had sort of the characteristics of a bird, of an alligator. It supposedly had a head that resembled an emu, with a long bill, and on each side of its body were these sort of serrated edges, kind of like the bone on a stingray. And its hind legs were sort of thick and strong, and the forelegs were sort of smaller. And it was almost like what you would call like a chimera, sort of a collection of all different weird creatures put into one. But, it's a fascinating story. I don't take the literal story literally, but it would not surprise me, given the locations, and, Australia has a lot of marshy areas. It's not, a lot of people think, just desert, etc. There's a lot of marshes and lagoons, things like this, forests. So I wouldn't be surprised if something prompted the story of the bunyip itself. However, the sheer number of different animals that seem to be tied into it, I find that unlikely. But, you often find where there's a legend and a folkloric story, there usually is some sort of genuine original story that prompts to kick it all off in the first place.
Absolutely. Everything in folklore started with some kind of experience in the human past. So there you go.
Right.
Nick Redfern, wonderful show as always. I can see a few more shows coming up because of your great new books, and we'll be talking to you soon.
All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Okay, very good. Nick Redfern.
Have a good one.
Living legend. All right. So, go ahead, Ben.
Well, we will begin with the outro announcements. Many thanks to the Blackstone, Mass. Public Library, which hosted us for a program on poltergeists this past week, and to the Museum of Working Culture here in Woonsocket, which hosted my dad last evening for a program on our local cases.
Actually, the technical issues last night were scarier than anything I could have said.
I mean, technology can be scary sometimes.
No, but Sarah Carr, assistant director of the museum, she pulled it together, and we got it done. So it was a great program.
What's the saying? The ghost in the machine?
Yes, exactly. Well, it was a fundraiser for the museum, which I can't imagine was easy to do on Zoom, but I guess it was. They pulled it off. It was great. So anyway, with any luck, COVID restrictions allowing, we plan to speak at the New England Parafest on April 10th and 11th of 2021 in Kittery, Maine. And we will do a live broadcast of this show with a panel of the speakers on Sunday the 11th. More information will be forthcoming. So by all means, check out our books along with those of our other co-hosts at our show website, behindtheparanormal.com, where you can also find more about the show, our many cases over the years, our public appearances, and how to book us, along with some of our close to 900 free recorded shows from our 12 plus years on the air, including our 4.5-year run on CBS Radio, along with special shows and podcasts.
And past shows back to late 2009 are also available on major podcast platforms, including YouTube, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, the Paranormal Radio app, and more. And soon, we plan to have all shows back to 2008 uploaded to those apps. Yeah,
it's quite an undertaking, as you can imagine. Also, we're getting a lot of inquiries where people can see the documentary we were in recently on the Travel Channel, the Devil's Road, the true story of Evelyn Rain Warren. That can be seen as, I guess it was so successful. One of the producers told us that it was had the highest ratings and viewership of any show ever shown on the Travel Channel. So that's pretty good for the Travel Channel, I guess. 1.5 million or something. So anyway, you can see that on there's a Travel Channel app where you can see it, and I believe they're still airing it, so just check your local schedules. And there are links to several charities we have adopted on the show, including USA Cares, Canadian Veterans Advocacy, Helping Haiti's Orphans, Youth Mentoring Connection in Los Angeles, Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of America, and the Sisterhood of Ground Zero. We know these folks who run these charities, and the money goes where it should, so it's great. Ben, what do we have for next week?
So, next week, November 1st, we'll tackle the modest topic of quantum night and whether any form of human consciousness can save the world. I won't be able to be here, unfortunately, but in my place will be legendary Timothy Green Beckley, and he has kindly agreed to sit in for me. So that should be a fun time.
Yeah, it's been a while since Tim has been a guest co-host, but he's in our stable of guest co-hosts, and he's a real living... He's been doing this longer than I have.
Yeah, we kind of keep him in the bullpen.
Years.
What? We kind of keep him in the bullpen, so to speak.
We do. It's pretty great. So we will look forward to that next week. So anyway, we'll leave you today with a quote that's a little different from Genesis chapter 1. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So good luck to the lake monsters and sea monsters.
Yeah. God made you, Loch Ness Monster. We still have a couple of seconds, but no, I like that it very specifically says the great creatures of the sea, and maybe that includes
Leviathan. Was
yes,
yeah.
So you are Paul Eno,
as far as I know.
Yes, and I am Ben Eno, and thank you for joining us on our great cosmic journey. And we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal, and have a happy Halloween. And remember, there's a skeleton in all of us.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with